Members of the Congress, it is my great privilege, and I deem it a high honor and personal privilege, to present to you Her Excellency Corazon C. Aquino, President of the Republic of the Philippines.
Mr. Speaker, Senator Thurman, distinguished members of Congress. 3 years ago, I left America in grief to bury my husband, Ninoy Aquino. I thought I had left it also to lay to rest his restless dream of Philippine freedom. Today, I have returned as the President of a free people. In burying Ninoy, a whole nation honored him. By that brave and selfless act of giving honor, a nation in shame recovered its own. A country that had lost faith in its future found it in a faithless and brazen act of murder. So in giving we receive, in losing we find, and out of defeat we snatched our victory. For the nation, Ninoy became the pleasing sacrifice that answered their prayers for freedom. For myself and our children, Ninoy was a loving husband and father. His loss, 3 times in our lives, was always a deep and painful one. 14 years ago this month was the first time we lost him. A president turned dictator and traitor to his oath, suspended the Constitution, and shut down the Congress that was much like this one, before which I am honored to speak. He detained my husband along with thousands of others, senators, publishers, and anyone who had spoken up for the democracy as its end drew near. But for Ninoy, a long and cruel ordeal was reserved. The dictator already knew that Ninoy was not a body merely to be imprisoned, but a spirit he must break. For even as the dictatorship demolished one by one the institutions of democracy, the press, the Congress, the independence of the judiciary, the protection of the Bill of Rights, Ninoy kept their spirit alive in himself. The government sought to break him by indignities and terror. They locked him up in a tiny, nearly airless cell in a military camp in the north. They stripped him naked and held the threat of a sudden midnight execution over his head. Ninoy held up manfully under all of it. I barely did as well. For 43 days, the authorities would not tell me what had happened to him. This was the first time my children and I felt we had lost him. When that didn't work, they put him on trial for subversion, murder, and a host of other crimes before a military commission. Ninoy challenged its authority and went on a fast. If he survived it, then he felt God intended him for another fate. We had lost him again, for nothing would hold him back from his determination to see his fast through to the end. He stopped only when it dawned on him that the government would keep his body alive after the fast had destroyed his brain. And so, with barely any life in his body, he called off the fast on the 40th day. God meant him for other things, he felt. He did not know that an early death would still be his fate, that only the timing was wrong. At any time during his long ordeal, Ninoy could have made a separate peace with the dictatorship, as so many of his countrymen had done. But the spirit of democracy that inheres in our race and animates this chamber could not be allowed to die. He held out in the loneliness of his cell and the frustration of exile, the democratic alternative to the insatiable greed and mindless cruelty of the right and the purging holocaust of the left. And then we lost him irrevocably and more painfully than in the past. The news came to us in Boston. It had to be after the 3 happiest years of our lives together. But his death was my country's resurrection and the courage and faith by which alone they could be free again. The dictator had called him a nobody. Yet 2 million people threw aside their passivity and fear and escorted him to his grave. And so began the revolution that has brought me to democracy's most famous home, the Congress of the United States.
Corazon Aquino. Corazon Aquino was married to Senator Benigno Aquino Jr., who was one of the most prominent critics of President Marcos. After the assassination of her husband on August 21, 1983, she emerged as leader of the opposition against the president. In late 1985, Marcos called for a snap election, and Aquino ran for president with former Senator Salvador Laurel as her running mate for vice president. So Corazon Aquino was married to Senator Benigno Aquino Jr. After the assassination of her husband, she emerged as a leader of the opposition against the president. After the election held on February 7, 1986, the Batasang Pambansa proclaimed Marcos and his running mate Arturo Tolentino as the winners, which prompted allegations of electoral fraud and Aquino's call for massive civil disobedience actions. Subsequently, the People Power Revolution, a non-violent mass demonstration movement, took place from February 22 to 25. The People Power Revolution, along with defections from the armed forces of the Philippines and support from the Philippine Catholic Church, successfully ousted Marcos and secured Aquino's accession to the presidency on February 25, 1986. Prior to her election as president, Aquino had not held any elected office. She was the first female president of the Philippines. Batasang Pambansa referred simply as the Batasan. The member of the Batasang Pambansa were referred as a Mambabatas Pambansa. Proclaimed by Marcos and his running mate Arturo Tolentino, which prompted allegation of electoral fraud and Aquino's call for massive civil disobedience action. The People Power Revolution took place from February 22 to 25. Corazon Aquino was the first female president of the Philippines. You see, girls can do everything by the trust. Don't underestimate the girls because girls can fight what is right. Because girls is always right. Makakaya ng babae kung ano ang makakaya ng lalaki. President, Aquino oversaw the drafting of the 1987 Constitution, which limited the powers of the presidency and re-established the bicameral Congress, successfully removing the previous dictatorial government structure. Her economic policies focused on forging good economic standing amongst the international community as well as establishing Marcos-era crony capitalist monopolies, emphasizing the free market and responsible economy. Her administration pursued peace talks to resolve the moral conflict, and the result of these talks was creation of the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao. Aquino was criticized for the Mindiola massacre, which resulted in the shooting deaths of at least 12 peaceful protesters by Philippine state security forces, and the unlawful treatment of people who work on their so-called owned Hacienda Lucita, which led to bloody protests ordered by President Corazon Aquino to rotate and ensure the ownership of her family's vast sugar estate from the Agrarian Reform Program. The Philippines faced various natural calamities in the latter part of Aquino's administration, such as the 1990 Luzon earthquake and tropical storm Thelma. Several coup attempts were made against her government. She was succeeded as president by Fidel V. Ramos and returned to civilian life in 1992. So, bisag unsang calamities ang niabot sa Pilipinas, Corazon Aquino was never give up, supporting and leading the Philippines as the first female president. By Fidel V. Ramos, she was succeeded as president and returned to civilian life in 1992.
3 years ago, I left America and grief to bury my husband, Ninoy Aquino. I thought I had left it also to lay to rest his restless dream of Philippine freedom. Today, I have returned as the president of free people. In burying Ninoy, a whole nation honored him. By that brave and selfless act of giving honor, a nation in shame recovered its own. A country that had lost faith in its future found it in a faithless and brazen act of murder. So in giving, we receive, in losing we find, and out of defeat we snatch our victory. For the nation, Ninoy became the pleasing sacrifice that answered their prayers for freedom. For myself and our children, Ninoy was a loving husband and father. His loss 3 times in our lives was always a painful one. The government sought to break him by indignities and terror. They locked him up in a tiny, nearly airless cell in a military camp in the north. They stripped him naked and held the threat of sudden midnight execution over his head. Ninoy held up manfully all of it. I barely did as well. For 43 days, the authorities would not tell me what had happened to him. This was the first time my children and I felt we had lost of him. At any time during his long ordeal, Ninoy could have made a separate peace with the dictatorship, as so many of his countrymen had done, but the spirit of democracy that inheres in our race and animates this chamber could not be allowed to die. He held out in the loneliness of his cell and frustration of exile a democratic alternative to the insatiable greed and mindless cruelty of the right and foregoing hoculos of the left. And then, we lost him. Irrecoverably and more painfully than in the past, the news came as in Boston. It had to be after and 3 happiest years of our lives together. But his death was the country's resurrection and the courage and faith by which alone they could be free again. The dictator had called him a nobody. 2 million people threw aside their passivity and escorted him to his grave. And so began the revolution that has brought me to democracy's most famous home, the Congress of the United States. The task had fallen on my shoulder to continue offering the democratic alternative to our people. Archibald MacLeish had said that democracy must be defended by arms when it is attacked by arms and by truth. When it is attacked by lies, he failed to say how it shall be won. I held fast to Ninoy's conviction that it must be by the ways of democracy. I held out for participation in the 1984 election of dictatorship called, even if I know it, will be gurgled. I was warned by the lawyers of opposition that I ran the grave risk of legitimizing the foreign result of elections that were clearly going to be fraudulent. But I was not fighting for lawyers, but for the people in whose intelligence I had implicit faith. By the exercise of democracy, even our dictatorship, they will be prepared for democracy when it came. And also, today, we face the aspiration of people who had known so much poverty and massive unemployment for the past 14 years and yet offered their lives for the obstruction of democracy. Wherever I went in the campaign, slum area, or impoverished village, they came to me with one cry: democracy, not food, although they clearly needed it, but democracy, not work, although they surely wanted it, but democracy, not money. For they gave that little they had to my campaign. They didn't expect me to work a miracle that would instantly put food into their mouths, clothes on their back, education in their children, and work that will put dignity in their lives. But I feel the pressing obligation to respond quickly as a leader of a people deserving of all these things. 3 years ago, I said thank you, America, for the haven from opposition and the home you give Ninoy, myself, and our children, and for 3 happiest years of our lives together. Today, I say join us, America, as we build a new home for democracy, another haven for the oppressed. So it stands and shining testaments of our two-nation commitment of freedom.
Good day, everyone. I'm going to share our critics about the speech of Corazon Aquino before the U.S. Congress. So, let's get started. I have here 10 critics about this topic. First, on the speech of Corazon C. Aquino, she was referring to Ferdinand E. Marcos when she said that a dictator imprisoned her husband. In Cory and Marcos' administration, they both revived the economy of the country. They exercise their power and act based on what they believe is right for their people. Corazon Aquino view Marcos' administration that has unjust and inhuman governance. He was overprotective in his laws that he will lock up those people who speak up for democracy. Before her presidency, the democracy was not achieved. She said that the country has lost its faith and will to see its future unfounded in the cruel fate without justice. Yes, she committed biases against Marcos because all she said was what Marcos did to her husband, on how Ninoy became a living sacrifice for freedom, and how he died in the hands of the military people. Her speech was focused on the wrongdoings of Marcos to gain the sympathy of people. She takes it personally, and she's so eager for Marcos to be removed from the presidency. On the martial law era, there was indignities and terrors. They are using violence and the government has no conscience that they didn't think twice to put someone in that. For 9 and 10, I was amazed when I learned that the former President Corazon Aquino was the one who restored our democracy from the martial law era. During her term, she made policies that will benefit the people, like giving them the freedom and right that they deserve, and also reviving the economy of the country. However, it is sad to know that her husband experienced the cruelty of military authorities when he just wanted to achieve democracy. Knowing that Cory Aquino didn't have an experience of being president, but she did her best, that she became the most prominent figure of the 1986 People Power Revolution, although she failed in the end and left the country suffering a power shortage crisis. And that's all for today, and thank you.